Today on Pilot's Discretion, we have our first two-guest episode as we're joined by astronaut Mike Mullane and his son Patrick, who is a new private pilot. They talk about aviation families, lessons learned from the space shuttle program, and what makes flight training weird. Pilot's Discretion starts right now. Welcome, everyone. I'm your host, John Zimmerman of Sporties. A reminder before we get started to visit sporties.com/podcast for all of today's show links and for access to every episode of Pilot's Discretion. You can also email us, podcast@sporties.com, if you have questions, comments, or guest ideas. This episode today will range pretty widely from Cessnas to space shuttles, as I'm joined by Mike and Patrick Mullane. Mike is a West Point graduate who flew over 100 missions in Vietnam as a weapons systems officer in RF-4 Phantoms, then flew 3 times on the space shuttle as a mission specialist. His son Patrick followed the military path as well, serving in the intelligence arm of the Air Force before entering the business world. And just last year, he finally finished what he started in high school, becoming a private pilot. They've each written very interesting books about their lives, which we'll link to in the show notes. Mike and Patrick, welcome to Pilot's Discretion.
Thanks for having us, John.
Great to be here.
Let's start with aviation families, because both of you grew up in that environment. Mike, your father flew B-17s in World War II. Patrick, obviously, you grew up with an astronaut for a father. And reading both of your books, it's clear that aviation and space were an essential part of family life, family conversations, family travel schedules. So, Mike, as a father, I'm wondering how you share that passion without forcing it on your kids. How do you find the balance between all in on a military and then a space career without being the over-controlling parent?
Well, I've never pressured my kids to follow in my footsteps, and I make sure they're exposed to all of the things that I think might someday take seed in their brains and they might want to follow. And certainly aviation is something I was around all the time. When I was flying in the backseat of Phantoms in England for 4 years and the kids were old enough, I would take them out to the flight line to watch these F-4s roar off the runway. And, they were just small children, but I'm sure it was planting a seed in Pat's mind that maybe he might want to do that. Now, the girls had absolutely no interest in it. I have 2 girls, and Pat, my son, both girls are into horses. They're not into airplanes. So it didn't. Obviously the seed grew with Pat and wanting to follow an aviation career, a private aviation career. But I've never pressured him. He got an appointment to West Point, which is my alma mater, and I didn't pressure. I just said, hey, do what you want to do. Don't think that I'm going to be one of these guys that want you to follow, be a legacy for me. You have your own life. Do what you want to do. And he decided he wasn't going to West Point. He said, why do I go to a place that people yell at me and there are not very many women there? So
that's true.
He decided to go to Notre Dame.
Now, Patrick, from your side of things, you watched your father launch into space, which must have been nerve-wracking. I mean, certainly stressful for Mike strapped into the space shuttle, but also, as you detail, both of you detail, there is stress there on the family side. Is there some similarity there in terms of, I know a lot of pilots, when they first get into aviation, they have to have some sort of talks with family and everything about the safety or the rationality of being a pilot. Are there any lessons maybe private pilots should remember about the non-pilot family members coming along for a journey like this?
Yeah, I think it's as straightforward as that. It's often harder for the person who's watching their loved one do something they perceive to be as dangerous than the person who's doing the thing that is perceived as dangerous. I think certainly my father would say the same. I've heard him say it before, that it's probably easier to be sitting on a rocket waiting for it to light up than to be standing 3 miles away watching it from afar. And certainly, we can't get inside each other's heads, but I certainly felt an immense amount of stress. I try to be as honest with my wife, who is a nervous commercial flyer, much less a private flyer, that, contrary to what a lot of the general public might think about, flying being safer than driving, the stats, unfortunately, in general aviation don't bear that out. Now, the good news is that 70% or so of those can be corrected by pilots doing the right thing and good aeronautical decision making and so forth. But if you're going to be honest with your loved ones, you have to be honest about that. And so I have been, and God bless her, she still crawled in the cockpit with me. But I do think that's the lesson, is to make sure that you're honest and that you understand that it can often be harder for those who love you to take on the risk than it is for you to take on the risk.
Mike, would you agree with that? That you're more, when you're on the strapped into the rocket, you're thinking about procedures more than maybe the people watching you?
Well, I certainly had time to think about my wife and kids up on the roof of the Launch Control Center, and I did worry for their worry. But like Pat said, I made certain before I ever flew on a shuttle that I've talked to my wife, talked to my children, and said, "Hey, this is something. It's a dream come true for me. It's incredibly dangerous. I may not come back, but I want you to know that I love you, and it's just something I have to do." I made certain that all my affairs were in order. I had insurance policies on my life, and wrote the insurance companies and told them that I was getting ready to fly on a shuttle, and I wanted a letter from them saying that my life was covered for that. And they all wrote back and said yes, and I stapled those to my will. I was very open with my wife on how things would be handled if I should die. I know the shuttle is immensely more complex and a lot of dangers there, but it's aviation. The dangers are there, in a light airplane just as it is in a fighter, just as it is on the shuttle. But I've always been honest with my kids, and I think that helps them deal with the stress when they're watching.
Now, Patrick, last year you earned your private pilot license, decades after starting down that path. And I thought it was interesting. You said one of the most surprising things about that process is something other pilots notice many times is the age gap sometimes between student and instructor. And I thought you summed it up well. You said, quote, "I know of no other industry where the young teach the old," quote unquote, on such a large scale. This can create some weirdness. So tell us about that dynamic and what the potential trap is there.
Yeah, well, as you say, it's not surprising in retrospect, because young people who want to make a career of aviation, obviously, and the listeners of this podcast know this well, have to find a way to make money and get time at the same time. And so the way to do that often for many of them is to become a CFI. And so they tend to be younger. Certainly the flight school I was at tended to be much younger than the average student. And obviously, a lot of that, as many people know, has to do with the fact that it's expensive to get your private pilot certificate. Often you have to have either some professional success or a wealthy relative that can help support you. So that tends to, in the first case, tends to bias students to the middle-aged category and the instructors to being younger. And the thing that I found weird about this is I did sense at times instructors were reluctant to challenge or correct me. And frankly, part of this might have had to do, to be honest, with the fact that my father was an astronaut. Maybe they thought that I was some savant and should just have inherited whatever DNA my father had. But I think I think even for other people who don't have that that aspect to their lives, it's this issue of just a younger person telling an older person what to do. And the thing that I think is dangerous about it from the student standpoint, if you're a older, and I put that in air quotes because that could be anything from probably 35 to 80, that you recognize that in your instructor that they know that it's hard and that they have to force themselves to correct you. And so don't take advantage of that just because you've had a success in business. Or whatever your passion may be outside of flying, does not mean that you're God's gift to aviation. And to be arrogant enough to disregard the instruction or advice of somebody who's younger, frankly, portends bad things for the future, because I firmly believe that arrogance, that's not fair. Arrogance and bad luck with respect to decisions often as well can doom a pilot. So I think it's really important to be conscious of that disparity and not feed into it, to be very humble. Humility keeps you alive. That's what I've learned.
Certainly a good way to sum it up. Humility does keep you alive. And Mike, I'm curious from your standpoint, though, from a military background, how do we say it? Military pilots are not always known for their humility. But there is at some level a commitment to safety. And I know you were telling me earlier about an experience you had flying in Vietnam with a more senior officer. I mean, tell us about, in the very extreme side of military aviation, how do you balance that, command structure, but also humility and giving the person in the back seat, for example, the option to weigh in?
Well, first of all, I think the Air Force, certainly the right stuff image of arrogant single-seat pilots, that was real. The Air Force has NASA and all organizations embrace the idea of teamwork in a very big way. So I'm sure in the Air Force, finding people arrogant just because they have more time and higher rank is probably something that gets stomped on pretty hard. I would hope it is. I think the message for everybody, hey, there's no rank or seniority when you're in a hazardous operation. Everybody in that cockpit counts. And I'll give you an example of how rank was taken out of the cockpit to make sure that I was empowered, and that was when I was in Vietnam. I was flying in the back seat of the photo reconnaissance version of the Phantom at the time, and I was flying regularly. And I was a 23-year-old first lieutenant. Most of the time, I was flying with other junior officers, but on this particular day, a brigadier general from headquarters had come to be my pilot, and those guys didn't fly very often. And here I was getting in his back seat for a combat mission. And before I got into the cockpit, he stopped me and said, "Mike, you see these stars on my shoulder?" And he pointed to these camouflage stars on his flight suit there. And I said, "Yes, sir." And trust me, when you're a first lieutenant, that's all you see. But he said, "Listen, if I make a mistake up there, these stars are not going to protect us. You're going to die a millisecond after I do." And so his message was, you're empowered. He did not want me being intimidated by his rank and sitting there allowing him to do something stupid because he didn't have as much combat time as I did. So that was a very empowering moment, a wonderful example of great leadership that has stayed with me forever. That's called cockpit resource management. And that's how you do it, folks. You get into whoever gets in the left seat of any aircraft or in the command pilot seat should look around at every crew member and say, hey, you see something, you say something. Don't assume somebody else is going to say it, you say it. Don't assume I'm aware of it, you say it. I would empower everybody in any hazardous environment, and certainly in aviation.
Yeah, what a powerful lesson there. Certainly one I think the airlines have learned over the years, and one that I think general aviation pilots can take to heart as well, whether it's, Patrick, like you said, with a flight instructor who maybe is younger than you, or even just with passengers. Sometimes when you're loading up, the passengers don't really know where they stand on the chain of command, so to speak, in a Cessna or Cirrus, and just letting them know that they can be part of the crew in their own unique way, I think can do a lot to set the tone there. Guys, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with some more questions in just a minute.
Earn your pilot's license, get current, or add a rating. No matter what your goal is, Sporty's pilot training app will save you time and money. It's available on all your devices, including iPad, iPhone, Android, and smart TVs, so you can access Sporty's award-winning videos anywhere. Plus, with automatic sync between platforms and free lifetime updates, you'll always be up to date. Over 25 courses are available, from private pilot to aerobatics. Visit sportys.com/courses to try it free. Now, back to pilot's discretion.
All right, we're back with Mike and Patrick Mullane. And Mike, I want to talk about your time as an astronaut. So many lessons I'm sure you learned. One area that I think is very interesting for pilots is the concept of normalization of deviance, a phrase that really entered American culture probably with the Challenger disaster. And you were an astronaut at the time, so I'm sure it's much more than just an academic subject to you. Tell us what that phrase means and how it applies to safe operations, whether I'm in a space shuttle or a Cessna 172.
Well, normalization of deviance, the short definition is repeatedly shortcutting safety best practices until that behavior becomes your new normal. And now it's invisible to you. It's normal to you. And what normalization does is it leads to another term that came out of the Challenger tragedy was a predictable surprise, which Challenger was. And in hazardous operations, we all know what the predictable surprise can be. It can be injury, it can be fatalities. The Challenger was lost because of a 4-year normalizing the results of a criticality 1 deviance in the in the O-rings. This gets complex, and I won't spend any time on it, but the boosters were made in segments because they were so large and made in Utah. They had to be shipped in segments down to Kennedy Space Center where they were assembled. And there, to seal the hot gases, which burned at 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, they had O-rings at the joints that form a redundant steel-to-steel pressure seal. As long as those O-rings held, there was no path for the fire to pass to the outside and melt the steel. On Challenger, both O-rings failed on the bottom segment of the right side solid rocket booster at ignition. During early flight, it melted a giant hole in the side of the booster and caused the rocket to come apart, killing the 7 astronauts. Well, in the investigation, it found there were 12 instances in the 24 missions prior to Challenger where O-rings burned. And that's exactly what brought down Challenger. But under tremendous schedule pressure at the time, to keep the shuttle flying, rationalizations were made on why the damage that they were seeing was okay. Initially, when they saw the first damage, they did some offline testing and rationalized that as long as the damage never exceeded 1/10 of an inch, approximately, it would continue to form a pressure seal. Now, that was a huge departure from what had previously been documented in the risk analysis document, where any damage was intolerable. There was no allowance for it. But now flights continued under the umbrella of this test that the O-rings were more robust and could take some damage and continue to form a pressure seal. And that was all done to accommodate a very intense and ambitious launch schedule. That's typically what drives people into shortcutting safety best practices, is they are under some type of tremendous pressure, some type of schedule pressure. Maybe you have to get somewhere in a hurry, so you go out to that cockpit and you start shortcutting safety best practices, and nothing bad happens. So now the next time you're in that pressure circumstance, you do it again, and pretty soon it's your ops normal. You don't see it anymore as a deviance. And that's ultimately what occurred with the Challenger decisions, accepting this burned O-rings repeatedly until it ended in a predictable surprise, as they say, catastrophically killing 7 astronauts.
Yeah, that reminds me of the 4 most dangerous words, I think, in aviation, which is, it's always like that. You walk out to an airplane and there's a squawk or there's something that looks wrong, and you ask somebody and say, oh, don't worry about that. It's always like that, which to me is sort of a red flag that you're in that realm where what was once not okay is all of a sudden just the normal routine. Right.
I've heard it a little bit different. I've seen that before. You go to the plane. We saw that before. And people begin to say, well, okay. And by the way, I was talking to a nuclear power company someplace, and they had a pressure valve somewhere that was showing some issues, and they repressurized it from the opposite direction to fix it. And sure enough, it fixed itself for a while, but then the same problem appeared later on. And that procedure of going kind of kludging it to reset the pressure seal became normal. That became how you dealt with it, even though when it finally failed to the point they had to shut down whatever and go in and change it out at great expense and great impact to the schedule. But that had become normal. That's how they were dealing with this problem. They'd seen it before. So you got to be careful of that. Go back to basics. Follow your procedures. Don't shortcut your procedures, those checklists. I know I'm pontificating here, but what I tell people, checklists in hazardous environments are figuratively written in blood, and they certainly are in aviation. There's a history of tragedy incorporated in the checklist that you see every day in those airplanes. History of tragedy, planes crashed, crews died, lessons were learned, and now those lessons have been incorporated into these procedures to protect you. So follow your procedures. That's the best way you can avoid this normalizing deviance.
Yeah, I was struck reading your book how close some of those space shuttle launches came to launch and then were canceled at the last minute, sometimes with literally seconds to go, which to me speaks of discipline, of having the discipline to say, even though we're all geared up to go, the equivalent of the airplane being on the runway with your hand on the throttle, how do you have the discipline as both a person but also in a system to do that, to make that call and to scrub it at the last minute? Because I think that's something pilots struggle with a lot. You get going down the pathway and you think, well, I've come this far. We're kind of committed, I guess. So how do you have the discipline to step back and say no?
Well, actually, astronauts aren't the ones that make those calls on launch morning. In fact, you don't want the astronauts making those calls because it's easy when you're out there for hours and hours and you just want to get going. All this fear and emotion draining you. You don't want to repeat it the next day. You really want to go. And we call it launch fever. And so that's why that decision making as to whether we're going to launch or not is made by the launch director, who is very cool of head, and he or she is not going to be stampeded into a wrong-headed decision. They're going to pull the plug on the launch, and they get that from countless simulations. They in launch control, mission control, the astronauts, we go through countless simulations, integrated simulations, where we see these things and we know what the flight rules are. And you follow the flight rules. There were times we were sitting in that cockpit and the weather was just a little marginal, and we're sitting there praying, oh, just make a special observation and give us clearance. And that didn't come, and we had to stop. And of course, it's just so emotionally draining, but it's certainly the right decision. And I'm glad for those launch directors and those mission control folks. They're wonderful people, and they keep us safe.
Yeah, maybe there's a lesson there for pilots to have somebody outside of the airplane who you can at least call on to maybe check for some outside advice, to be your so to speak launch director and get an outside perspective on whether what you're planning is really a good idea.
Everybody can be everybody be in the grips of launch fever, whether it's launching off on a Cessna or whether it's launching on a shuttle. You just don't want to delay, whatever the reason is. You don't want to come back and do it tomorrow. You want to get it done. It's launch fever. Be careful.
Patrick, I want to turn to you because your current job is at Harvard Business School Online. And I've heard many pilots in the business world say that learning to fly made them better at business. But I'm wondering about the other way around. Are there business school concepts that can make us better pilots?
Yeah, I think so much of business, you think about the stock market and the idea that if you could see the future, you'd never have to work a day in your life again, obviously, because you'd know what was going to happen every day. And the flip side of that coin is that uncertainty is everywhere. You just don't know, what is coming. And the challenge in business, and certainly I learned this, not only do I work at Harvard Business School, but I got my MBA there many, many years ago. I feel like an old guy now. But is this balance between the discipline of a plan and taking action in the face of uncertainty. And certainly in my own training, I think, and I make it a habit to read, good and bad outcome reports from aviation accidents, is how to get yourself ready to go slow to go fast. The idea that when you run into an anomaly during a flight, making a rash decision in most cases, certainly in some you need to be quick, but you're probably better off not making the situation worse by giving it some thought and then taking action. And certainly in business it's the same. If you have a plan and you execute on it and you initially don't get the outcomes you expected, it may not make sense to keep pressing ahead with that plan. It's the old adage about how a battle plan in the military never survives first contact with the enemy. Well, it's very similar here, is that you can make all the plans you want, but the uncertainty in the world is going to make sure that those plans aren't going to be able to be followed to a T. So if you can't follow them, the question is, what do you do? And I think they're getting back to this concept of going slow to go fast, is to have some measured thought about what the situation is, what you can do to remedy it, and then take the action, just as actually the FAA teaches in better words than I've just used when you're going to get your private pilot certificate. So I did find a lot of similarities there. And it is hard, though, getting back to this idea of normalization and deviance, because as humans, we want to assume that, in fact, there's been studies about this, you tend to have confirmation bias about what you think is going to happen. And even in the face of not seeing it, you still convince yourself it's going to happen. Obviously, in aviation, this happens a lot with weather. Well, the forecast said it wasn't going to have ceilings at 300 feet AGL. It was going to be at 3,000 feet. And it doesn't matter how much you wish that to be true, it's just not. So those were the lessons that I certainly took in reverse from my business training when I got into flying.
Yeah, I would agree that sense of viewing the world as it really is, not as you hope it to be, is so valuable in both. And I certainly don't have a Harvard MBA to back that up, but would agree that the ability to recognize that is such a valuable skill, both in the business world and the aviation world.
Mm-hmm.
Mike, I wonder if that lines up with your experience from the military world. There's a tension there between doing something and not being just a passenger along for the ride, but also being impulsive and making a mistake. I mean, where's the line there?
Well, on that topic, Hoot Gibson, my commander on my second shuttle mission, had a great expression. He said, "There's no emergency that cannot be made worse by taking too hasty of an action." And that's probably good advice. The Air Force, when I was flying in the Air Force, we had checklists that had many different emergency procedures covered: engine fire, generator failures, those type of things. But of course, there are other emergencies that can come up, and you'd have to deal with them. And I'm sure it's the same in the civil world. But the guidelines that we were taught to handle any emergency in the military world, any aviation emergency, was first, maintain aircraft control. And because we all know of many cases where people went off troubleshooting a problem, lost control of the plane and crashed. The next is analyze it, take the time to analyze the situation, and then take appropriate action. I had a real life experience in an F-111 fighter bomber that just drives home this point about maintaining aircraft control. I was a high time backseater in Phantoms at the time of this story. It was my very first flight in the F-111 swing wing fighter bomber. The Goose, or the Wizzo, rides the right side of the pilot in the F-111. We were on this flight. It was a high time F-111 guy in the left, aircraft commander. We were doing supersonic weapons testing over the Gulf of Mexico. We got to our calculated bingo fuel point, go home fuel point. I pointed it out to the pilot. He elected to continue, thinking it was only going to take a couple more seconds to wrap the test up, get the last data point. I questioned his decision, but he pressed ahead. And the next thing we know, we have a low fuel warning light on, and we're out 50 miles or so over the Gulf of Mexico in an airplane that's very large and eats a lot of gas. And at that point, the pilot became very fixated on the gas situation. And I might have to shorten the story, but ultimately the result was, in that fixation, he came in way too fast and too high. When we hit the runway, he tried to force the plane down on the runway. We bounced back into the air, and there's a habit of F-111 pilots to sweep the wings full forward when you touch down to increase and induce drag and shorten the landing roll. And he did that. Well, that put our CG out of limits, and so now the plane's out of control. And ultimately, after hitting the runway a couple more times, he kept trying to get it to stay on the runway. We were well above landing speed and out of control in the time we were in the air. So as departure into the runway was appearing, I was hollering to go around, but he didn't want to go around because of the low fuel state. I initiated ejection, and we blasted out of the cockpit, the cockpit separates from the jet, got a parachute, and got one swing on it before we hit the ground. That was a very, very close call. Looking back on it, there's a number of lessons I learned there. One, looking back on it, is I was not very aggressive in challenging him on continuing past the go-home fuel state. And I know why now, is that rank situation. I was the Goose, he was the aircraft commander. He had hundreds of hours in the plane. I had 30 minutes of flying time in at that point. So I can see I was deferring to him in judgment when it came to safety, which I wouldn't have done in an F4 because I was a high time guy in an F4. I would have been much more aggressive about challenging the decision to press past bingo fuel. But again, very subtly, I can see that I figured, well, he's the aircraft commander, has all these time. He's got to know better than me. And obviously that turned out poorly. So again, it's see something, say something. He is a great pilot too, by the way. Just a bad day there where he aggressively wanted to finish a test and ended up in a situation where he was focused on the fuel situation at the expense of maintaining aircraft control and setting us up for the only landing attempt we were going to get.
All right, guys, it's time for our Ready to Copy segment. This is where I'll ask some semi-random questions, and you give me your quick answer. Are you ready to copy?
Ready to copy.
I am, I guess. I feel like...
Well, Mike, we're going to put you on the spot first. Describe a shuttle launch for us in 5 words or less.
Terrifying and absolutely wonderful. It's a dream come true, folks. You're scared, but you're boundlessly joyful.
That was 15 words, but we'll let it go.
Yeah, hold on, let me try. You're scared, but boundlessly joyful. There you go. 5 words right there.
We'll take it. Patrick, were you more nervous watching your dad launch on the shuttle or on your first solo?
Oh, first solo, easy.
I was too. When I was...
Mike, what's a non-obvious tip for somebody who wants to be an astronaut? If I want to follow in your footsteps, I know I should probably study hard, get good grades, be in good shape, all that kind of stuff. But what's a non-obvious tip from somebody who's been there?
Make sure you're a team player. Get involved with as many teams as possible. Bands, sports teams. If you're real young, student government at universities, just learn how to work together with other people toward a common purpose. NASA values that. I mean, let's face it, they have lots of people who are the geniuses in engineering and physics and whatever. But if you're not a team player, they're not going to give you a second look. Got to be a team player.
I've heard the same advice for the corporate aviation world, that lots of people can fly airplanes, but not everybody can sit next to you for 8 hours a day in the airplane. So sometimes those personal skills matter as much as the stick and rudder. All right, Patrick, you wrote recently, quote, "Getting humans to space is a form of art." What do you mean by that?
I think when you think of, is it Arthur C. Clarke's 3 laws? One of them is that any it's sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And I think that aviation, space flight, things that don't seem to be possible to most people are much like viewing the masterworks of the great artists. Is you look at it, you say, how can somebody do that? Yet we can. Humans are infinitely ingenious and creative, both in the artistic realm and the engineering realm and the physics realm. And so I think that's how you can relate art to what we do in the aviation world.
Mike, would you ride on one of the new commercial space rockets, one of these new ones from SpaceX or Blue Origin? Would you take a ride?
Absolutely. I particularly, SpaceX and Blue Origin both have vehicles that have powered flight escape systems. The capsule will separate and parachute to safety. That's what made the shuttle so scary when you're out there on that shuttle, is that it had no escape system. If anything went wrong, you had no ejection seats, no pods. That's a very uncomfortable feeling when you're sitting on such a incredibly complex machine where everything has to work. There's many different failure modes. It's also a monument to the people who designed and built it, that it was able to operate, with the exception of 2 tragedies, able to operate so successfully. And actually, both of those tragedies were not so much of a failure of the machine as it was a failure of the people in interpreting early warnings. But yes, I would fly on SpaceX and Blue Origin, no question.
Do you think we'll get to Mars in the next, say, 30 years, like some people dream?
Well, 30 years. Yeah, I think that we'll have somebody on Mars in 30 years, assuming geopolitics don't end up in another world war or something. The reason I say it too is I see Musk is driving so hard. I think if NASA can't do it, he'll do it himself. I think there's a lot of momentum headed there.
Patrick, like me, you're a twin. So can you read your twin's mind?
No, not at all. I think as we discussed earlier, there probably are not 2 people more different on the earth than those that love horses and those that love airplanes, with the exception of, I can't remember her name, whoever wrote West with the Night, Merle.
Beryl Markham,
yeah. She liked both, and I've read that book, but I have to admit I glossed over the horse parts.
Mike, I know you're an avid mountain climber, so what's your favorite mountain?
Any 14er in Colorado, any 14,000 foot peak that I can get on the top, is my favorite. They're all beautiful. There is one Challenger point that has a plaque to the Challenger crew that I find spiritual to go up there and stand next to that. That's the most, or I should say, the least visited Challenger memorial on the planet. Is that not many people are going to climb up to 14,000 feet to see that plaque. And by the way, it wasn't put up there by astronauts. It was put up there by engineers. Or right after Challenger, some engineers decided they wanted to do something, and they were mountaineers, and they're the ones that went up there and installed it. No astronaut had anything to do with that. So I wrote a blog on that. It's a very interesting story, actually.
And I was a little disappointed you didn't say Kilimanjaro since you did it with your son.
Oh, that's true. That's true. Kilimanjaro was fun. Yeah, no question.
All right, guys, our final question is always the same in this podcast. You have one final flight, and we want to know, what are you flying and where are you going? Patrick, you want to start out?
Yeah, I think it would be an open cockpit biplane, 2 places with Dad in one, me in the other. I live up in the Boston area. I'd want to fly to Katama, which is a grass strip on Martha's Vineyard, and land there with him and have an adult beverage, spend the night, and then fly home.
Mike?
Well, I would second that, but I'll tell you, one time we'd fly the F-111 out of Eglin Field in Panhandle of Florida to Tonopah in Nevada. They have an instrumented range there and drop various weapons there, inert weapons, to check the dynamics or whatever. And we had one release point. We did it multiple times, but it was at 100 feet and Mach 1.3. Now, it's table flat out there, but boy, I'll tell you, I'd love to go back and do that again, to see the world go by at 1.3 Mach and 100 feet off the ground. Yeah,
I'm changing my answer to that one.
Yeah. Well, I remember it was near sunset that we were doing this last run on it, and we pulled up, and I looked back, and it was dead calm. They gave us the weather as we're coming in. It was dead calm, no wind at all. And we pull up, and I look back, and there is this haze of dust, probably a dozen feet high, where the shock wave going off, it had lifted the dust into the desert air. And so I look back, and you can just see that dust, behind you in an otherwise calm wind world. It was weird. By the way, it had cattle out there too that we were going over, and I was thinking they must be deaf to have that shock wave hitting them over and over and over.
Well, if you ever get the invite and need some carry-on luggage, I'd be happy to stow away with you. That sounds pretty great. Mike's book is called Riding Rockets, The Outrageous Tales of a Space Shuttle Astronaut. Patrick's book is called The Father, Son, and Holy Shuttle, Growing Up as an Astronaut's Kid in the Glorious 80s. Mike and Patrick, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you, John.
Thank you very much, John.
Thanks for listening to Pilot's Discretion, brought to you by Sporty's Pilot Shop, training and equipping pilots worldwide for over 60 years. For more episodes and links to additional information, visit sportys.com/podcast. And if you have comments or guest ideas, email podcast@sportys.com. I'm John Zimmerman. We'll see you next time on Pilot's Discretion.